biggest challenge that we face now is to quantify the digital economy, which has been laid out. And then, of course, the next problem is on regulation. I think let's start at the problem of valuing. So we know that a lot of the transactions, purchases, interactions that we do today are through digital modes. And a lot of these platforms generate revenue based on these different models. So for example, for sale and purchase, you have e-commerce platforms. For interactions, you have classic Facebook-like platforms. And what we've seen over the last few years is that there are international organizations like the OECD, which have struggled to find what is the value add, right? So what exactly is the value generated by these platforms? And these could vary in form, these could vary in size, and what we've seen is the Indian government has shown quite a bit of interest on estimating. So what is it that is the contribution to the GDP by these specific platforms is what is being attempted. In the last estimate for India, which was a joint study with a think tank in India, the value contribution or value added is estimated to be something around 30 lakh crores. And that gives us a sense that it's quite substantial. In terms of employment, if you look at its share in total employment, it's roughly around 2%. Now, while in terms of GDP, it's quite a lot, in terms of employment, it's quite small, which raises potential questions for future, which is to say that while there may be contributions to value add, to sales, will this be an employment generating expansion of the economy? And that brings us to the various questions on regulation. And there are people on this panel who will be well versed with many other regulations, but I'll talk about specifically from the side of taxation, which has been quite swift and adaptive in terms of responding to the changes of digital economy, which we've seen globally. So I think the first one is to say that if today a large tech corporation is operating in India, how do we say these operations are in India? And how much of what they do is actually based in India? Because they have not only services that they provide, but they have infrastructure that they use, which could be across the world. So for example, a lot of us use our phones and generate data, and where does this data really sit? And I think the panelists will talk about the bill that, or the act that we have in India dealing with the specific location of our information. But I think this is a problem that has riddled many in the economy on where this is exactly located. And all of us receive prompts, advertisements, which we respond to based on the data that we provide. And so there's a lot of processing and intellectual property which is used based on our information. And then the question is that who owns this intellectual property and where are these returns to be rewarded? And what we've seen in the last few years is that there has been sort of a proactive response by the government to implement taxes based on provision of some of these services, especially on the digital advertising bit. I think the value add problem also becomes quite prominent when you look at industries such as gaming. So the fundamental question as economists would ask is, where is the value contribution happening? Is this a contribution of labor, if there is in the gaming industry, or is it just speculation or gambling? Similarly for cryptos, right? So we've seen that there was an adaptive response to what the government looks at as money. And then again, there are contributions by setting up of platforms and then trading. Then just like the financial markets, where we try to see what is the value add of these assets, where is value generated, similarly for crypto, it is quite important. All of this, I think, leads us back to what is the theme of this conference, is on government efficiency. I think we've seen that there have been experiments in the past. The government's tried to give benefits, has tried to track transactions in the economy, as we heard in the last session, through digitization. But I think what is required is that the mammoth size of information that is generated across spaces, especially through the collection of information by tax authorities, needs to be processed. In fact, if you look at the estimation of the digital economy, which the government has attempted in the past, is through information from companies. And I guess there's a possibility to use transaction level data, exchange level data, to bring together and piece together what is the size of the digital economy, how much is immeasurable, and especially, we've all had questions about what is below the surface of the reported economy. And I think digitalization sort of gives you an opportunity to do that, even though it is a challenge in terms of how different sectors operate and how they're measured. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Let me start by saying India is not easy to govern. I just want to qualify that because I think, as was said previously, in the 75 plus years of freedom where we've got to, especially in terms of the depth of the digital economy in India and the usage of mobiles, I think the penetration in India is probably one of the highest in the world. So there's a lot that has been done that needs to be credited to the government, but there's always a lot more, right? Because we are not easy to govern, because we have such a large population, because we have such a large young population, because we are aiming towards a Viksit Bharat, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that there is government efficiency and using digital services to be able to do that. I think it requires a laser sharp focus by the government. Some sectors like Aadhaar, we've been very successful in implementing Aadhaar and using the bank accounts and your digital accounts to provide direct benefits to the citizens in the country. I think all of that has been wonderful, but that's not necessarily true for all sectors. I don't know how effective the NIC centers are. In the government usage of digitization, we are still extremely slow. Basic digitization of title and to be able to know whether your ownership of a property in India is protected or not, you have clean title or not, is still not there. I think it's a significant miss for businesses to be able to perform in India. I think when we look at how the government looks at digital services, including in the private sector, I think we take a very piecemeal approach sometimes. What we need to create is a digital ecosystem and promote the private sector to come here, to establish those centers, to have the technology available in India, which will also then help having the right people to help the government use the digital services. I think when you look at it from a minute perspective of how much tax can you get from it, and data localization for the purposes of being able to tax the industry, or what benefit is gaming giving to us, or what benefit crypto is giving to us from a societal perspective, I think it's a very narrow approach. You have to look at how am I going to be at the forefront of the digital transformation. That this shift that is happening today is a tectonic shift. With AI, the world is going to change so fast. If we now stay behind in terms of this growth, and if we overtax ourselves and we over-regulate ourselves, both will hinder us significantly in being at the forefront of the digital transformation. I think, we shouldn't miss the big picture in this small. We had a good crypto market and a good crypto industry growing. We had a good gaming industry going. And these are all parts of having the relevant people come to India, establish businesses, and then move on to the next. They'll start a gaming business, sell it, move on to do the next big AI thing. But if we keep, killing the roots, I think we are going to have a significant challenge in attracting the right talent to sit here and focus on making sure that India is part of this, amazing transformation that US and China is way, 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 way ahead of us. And so my take on this is we really need to stop worrying about the minute picture. We need to ensure that we create a ecosystem that will nurture digital transformation of India and look at the value add overall to the economy from the digital economy. And then you can start looking, maybe 10 years from now, when you've got this ecosystem created, imagine the amount of tax you can actually collect. Don't do it now, let it grow. And I think that will help government efficiency too. I'll stop at that.
Yep, thank you. I'll come back to you with the questions because you really opened up the area of discussion. Vivan, if I have to ask you to talk about the expansion of GST network, how do we do that? Your work essentially revolves around this topic, wherein we say that one nation, one tax, but essentially that actually has not happened. And while it has happened, it has become havoc.
Thank you. I'm just going to take on from the previous two speakers and come back to tax, and hopefully it all adds up. I think the other way of looking at efficiency is what makes government inefficient. And there are a few telltale signs of inefficiency in digital markets. Of course, tax is one of them, and the ideal of GST was one nation, one tax, as you say. If you start to fragment that even online, then that's a sign of worry. But coming back to the roots of inefficiency in digital regulation today, there are few. One is, of course, the way in which we think about the design of our regulation. So yesterday was Valentine's Day. You have some almost Valentine-like colors on your coat. If you tried to order flowers for your Valentine via, say, Ferns and Petals, you would have to give the email ID, number, and address of your Valentine, Gursharanji. And that will no longer be possible if the DPDP rules, the data protection rules, are implemented as they stand today. Now, this is a second order impact of, because the rules are, and the act is based on getting consent from the principal, the data principal. So in this case, it would be your Valentine, not you. So I'm just, the first point of order is therefore to think about the second order impact of digital regulation, which is a difficult thing to do unless you engage at the design stages of regulation with all manner of stakeholders. And it's, of course, incumbent on those stakeholders to come and speak to government, but that's always, whose door do you knock at? Who responds to you? What is the process? What is the channel? Are you only supposed to come to Habitat Center for these discussions, or are there other places to go to? It's an open question, and it's an important one, and we don't need to be in a rush to regulate if we don't answer this question properly, because the consequences then haunt us for decades on end. The second is the amount of inefficiency that, again, taking from ma'am's example on land records, there's a lot of land record equivalent inefficiencies online, in that there is a lot of lack of clarity on who regulates what when it comes to petitions in courts. So from over the last 10, 12 years, as data prices have gone down and a lot of new application classes and categories of market segments in the digital world have come up. Those include, of course, crypto and gaming, but there are many more that courts are wholly unfamiliar with. So for instance, digital media. When Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Hotstar, etc. started growing in the country, there are a lot of petitions in courts asking who regulates this content. And that took another couple of years to resolve And during that time, there was obviously a lot of blood, sweat, and tears going into the litigation process, both of the governance apparatus, which was, of course, grasping at straws for answers, and of the industry that was burgeoning at the point of time. And I think you can extrapolate from here and talk about any of these new industries that were mentioned. The threat of litigation erodes value long term, and obviously then has a bearing on taxation and the sort of revenue maximization impetus behind taxation. So we need to think about legal clarity for digital applications that are growing. Where does that legal clarity come from? Part of it is down to how we think about the principles or what our vision is for the digital economy. The first principles would be obviously anchoring any such vision. For GST, the principle was one nation, one tax. It's a fairly simple principle, right? The more you complicate a simple construct like that, the more you erode value. And I think this is true. I mean, the complexity of regulations is eroded value across the world without exception. So, for instance, there is how do we think about principles such as safe harbor, which is the concept that in exchange for certain responsibilities that I have to fulfill as a business that operates online, I get certain immunity from government, as long as I'm structured in a particular way where I am not sort of responsible for the actions of my users, right? So if you're coming onto my platform, say I'm a social media platform, you say something incendiary, like the guy did 3-4 days ago, around which there's a lot of debate, beer biceps. Now, if you held YouTube liable for what beer biceps guy said, I'm forgetting his name, Ranveer something, then that would erode a ton of value from the digital market for the reason that you would take YouTube to court. YouTube may cease to function as it does currently as a business, where all sorts of content, unless it's patently illegal, such as child sexual abuse material, etc., is hosted there. If you start holding it liable for everybody who's saying something off color that offends somebody's sensibilities, it would basically collapse the user-generated content market. So now the question here is a question of principle. Do we still value this principle of safe harbor for a business like YouTube or any analog in the Indian context? Or do we do away with it entirely, in which case somebody has to suggest what that concept is? It cannot be accountability. Accountability is very broad. It cannot be openness. It cannot be transparency. These are not the principles. You need a principle that can be operationalized as a neat substitute for the way we understood safe harbor or understand safe harbor today. That understanding is, of course, it has to undergo evolution as more and more actors arise, but you have to come up with analogous principles that can work. I mean, I can go on and on. I think one more aspect that I can just touch on is that we also waste a lot of regulatory cholesterol, and actually more, in these kind of conferences, we discuss this ad nauseum. What is this concept of level playing field? Indian businesses want level playing field. Foreign businesses that are smaller want it with larger foreign businesses, etc., etc. There's all sorts of permutations. Offshore gaming companies and onshore gaming companies have this fight on level playing field. Same with crypto, as I'm just extrapolating from the examples. And this, in many ways, this fight also of leveling the playing field began in the digital market with the e-commerce regulations that were embedded in our FDI policy. So there are a lot of areas like that where it's fairly simple. I mean, leveling the playing field at its very core should mean that you apply the same principles to every functionally similar business which conducts similar activities, and it cannot easily be categorized in a distinct class. So for instance, in e-commerce, why is it that we have certain rules for foreign players and not for Indian players? Is it the case that large Indian e-commerce companies do not erode value of the mom and pop stores and the retail ecosystem in the country? Or, are we using sort of industrial policy as a substitute for just basic reasoning, which, as somebody said, it's Trump's world, we can be frank. If reason and logic is the way in which we have to pummel through some of these principles, then so be it. So there's a lot of areas of digital regulation that we need to think through in a systematic manner that will impact taxation in the long term, because it impacts the way in which value accrues. And I think for taxation, suffice to say that the longer we can stay the ground on maintaining, the one nation, one tax construct, the better. I think we are fragmenting it, particularly in these new areas. You have this 28% tax for gaming now, for online gaming. And you are starting to use taxation as a means of flagging what you think is a sin sector, or perhaps a sector that advertises in the newspapers too often, whatever the case may be. So I think we need to take a few steps back and think about how this has a cascading impact on all sorts of novel innovations that are, again, those are sort of corollaries of the growth of new sectors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanjal. So I think we've, in this country and I think also elsewhere in the world, held GDPR as some sort of a model framework for data protection. And I just want to interrogate that a little bit. And there are a few reasons I think it's worth inquiring into whether GDPR really is the correct model. And even if it is a good model to use, is it the kind of model that you want to apply across the board to all kinds of enterprises, regardless of their relative bargaining power, their size of operations, etc. And I think the thing that immediately comes to mind is what recently happened in the US, just at the end of last month, where President Trump took a few actions to essentially put the new EU-US transatlantic data protection framework at risk by essentially firing 3 members out of the 5-member committee that was there to look at the surveillance mechanisms that were being followed. And what that suggests to me is that if one of the largest democracies, and certainly one of the largest economies, is willing to pour cold water over a data protection model that is being held and regarded as a good model and as a useful model, then should that not make the rest of the world, and particularly India, think about whether that really is a good model to follow? Now remember, in India, we're at a stage where we have a data protection legislation which has been passed by the Houses of Parliament and has received presidential assent but has not been brought into force. In fact, we're still at the rulemaking stage, and that is currently in the process of public consultation. I think what we run the risk of doing is painting everything with the same brush, painting all kinds of businesses in the same brush, regardless of whether they're small and large. And what we need to understand is that that may not be the proper or appropriate yardstick to use. Now, Vivan, during his opening remarks, gave you the example of how the data protection law as it currently stands essentially does away with the idea of gifting, in a sense, because the data principle in question is the one who is receiving the gift, and who are you as the gifter to be providing those details, and do you have the consent? There's the way the data protection law is modeled is that it basically says that you're prohibited from doing things. The only time when you are permitted to do something is when you have the consent to process personal data, or there's a very narrow list of exceptions under which you can operate without the use of consent. And whilst this kind of an approach works in a relationship between a citizen and the state, I'm not entirely sure whether that's entirely workable or even desirable in the context of relationships between different types of citizens. So what are the sort of things which the data protection framework puts you at some risk of doing. You know, if you think of it from the perspective of a small business. For one, you won't be able to send promotional emails unless you have the consent to do so. You know, that may or may not be a huge problem. You may not have the ability to maintain a customer database unless you explicitly get the consent to do something like that. We spoke about gifting. You may not be able to cross-sell products unless you've taken consent to be able to do something like that. Let's say you're running a subscription business of some sort. You know, unless you have specific consent, you may not be able to remind your customer that it's time to renew their subscription. Those are just some, you know, immediate things that come to my mind, and there are several other instances that businesses are having to confront. The law on GDPR, I think it's also important to remember that when the EU adopted this law, a lot of their businesses had already become fairly mature and had already had a lot of data to play with, in a sense. Whereas in India, whilst you have some businesses who are in a position to do that, larger established businesses, you have a section of new businesses that simply will not be in a position to do that and will be hit with this data protection legislation even before they're able to start running, so to speak. So I think those are some things which are, in my view, important to keep in mind. Now, I recognize that the data protection legislation does create some kind of exemptions. The one that immediately comes to mind is the exception. It empowers the central government to create an exemption for startups. But again, that is restricted to startups. It doesn't include the small and medium enterprises more generally. The last point I want to make is that, you know, GDPR itself, even among commentators in the EU, is coming under a lot of pressure and a lot of criticism, because there is now research since the GDPR was launched to show that there have been very, very tangible effects in terms of decline in profits to EU businesses. And the research goes to the extent of showing that smaller businesses have suffered twice as much of a decline in profits. Also, there's research that shows that a number of apps between the years 2016 to 2019, I think almost 33% of apps on the Google Play Store had to come down because of the impacts of GDPR. So I think when we have the benefit of this experience, and when we are following a law that is inspired by GDPR in a lot of ways, I think it's worth giving some consideration to the impact that GDPR has had, and trying to work out how a data protection framework that is best suited to the Indian model ought to be put into place.
Yeah, I mean, if you take specifically the sector, which is what we call the MSMEs, you know, the largest contributor to India's GDP, you know, the largest employer, and so on and so forth. And cutting across to the United States, the Trump mania, which is going on right now, India has been blindly following whatever the West has been doing. They said diversity, we picked up diversity. They said LGBT, we added plus Q to it. And now Trump is talking about only 2 genders. And now we are in a fix what to do. Similarly, to do with the GDPR and the data protection and stuff like that, we again picked up all of it. The recent, what you just mentioned, you know, adding consent manager to it, you will not be able to use the data. Now, take for example, you know, a company like ours. What are we selling? We're selling nothing. We're selling services. And how do I do business promotion? I met with a whole lot of these people. I exchanged my cards. Tomorrow, I'm not allowed to call them up unsolicited. So that's where I have to ask for a consent. Who's doing the consent? There is going to be an aggregator, the consent manager. Their data is going to be becoming a repository with the consent manager. So it's going to become a different kind of a monopoly. Are we trying to create a situation wherein the businesses, instead of growing, instead of thriving, are going to be shrinking back? So what impact it's going to have? You know, how do we use data? For a large organization, it might be okay, but for a small and medium enterprise, you can't have a parity between the two businesses. So, Pratibha, if I have to ask you, what kind of impact it's going to have? Is it desirable, and what's the outcome? And how can we best avoid it?
I think you've put it very well. It's not just about the companies, it's also about our economy. We are trying to be Viksit Bharat. We are not developed yet. And so to follow developed economies, regulations, and impose them on our businesses, so you are actually throttling their growth even before they could go out and fly. That is something that we try and tell the regulators all the time. Especially as a private equity fund, we have a lot of portfolio companies which are coming to that, coming to from the growth stage to becoming big. And for them, the biggest challenge in India is compliances, over-regulation. And so many licenses you have to take, so many regulations you have to comply with. And on top of that, they keep changing. Every month, there is a change across the board in terms of the regulations that they're applicable to them. And non-compliances then just become high. And then you're dealing with, so we take a lot of companies IPO. Now, SEBI says if you have any non-compliance anywhere across the board, we are not going to approve your prospectus, your listing. It's impossible in India. So that's why the listings are taking so long, and the cost is so high, because you're just sitting with the compliance team and going across each and every one of them. And most of them don't make sense. Now, DPDA, in the Indian context, in the European context, where it's a developed economy, people understand their privacy rights and want them enforced, versus here people don't even understand their privacy rights. On a lighter vein, if you talk to people, they're like, I like the ads that I get because, I Googled something. I honestly just accept all cookie options that are sent to me because it's just, takes too long to figure out what the options are. It's not reader friendly, most of those options that are given to me. So is it adding to the consumer's benefit? If it was significantly adding to what the consumer is getting in India, I would have said, please do it. Consumer Protection Act, RERA, those are all good regulations. DPDA, I get, and this is version 2.0 draft. We went through that whole exercise before, and we thought this draft would be, more thought through. And in the West also, you've got the US example, which is more principle-based regulation. You look at the concept of harm. What is the harm providing that data from one person to another does to anybody? That harm principle, I totally can relate to. But if there is no harm principle thought about, if you have not thought about for whose benefit you're doing the regulation, but at the same time you've made Indian businesses, Indian startups, Indian MSMEs, made it more difficult for them to be competitive around the world. Sometimes the regulators are only thinking about the big foreign companies in India. What is Google doing? What is Amazon doing? But what they don't realize is when they create those regulations, for them, the same regulations are then applied to your companies, your MSMEs, your startups. And that is having a debilitating effect on the economy, not just the company.
Suranjali?
So I'm not entirely well versed with this regulation, but I think one thing that I think we need to step back a little. And this is something I spoke at one of your conferences about 2 to 3 years ago. And I think
it hampers the ease of doing business as well.
Exactly. No, I think it's more fundamental than that. I think there needs to be a step back to answer the economic questions which have remained unanswered. I think all the regulations have been more reactive to what we're seeing across the world, Even developed economies, for example, the US is figuring out what it means for competition when you have large tech. The EU is figuring out what it means for trade and commerce. And I think it goes back to the issue of what is the value add, what does this mean for competition, and therefore how should we treat it in terms of different regulations. So should you, is it good to have 4 big companies, or should we have 20 companies? I don't think we've cracked that. Then again, Pratibha raised a very good point about the valuation of privacy, and this is something that has been experimented with in Africa, interestingly, where people were asked on how they value privacy, and honestly, nothing. They don't even know the value of what they're giving out until they're told about the monetization of it. So then again, you have to go back and ask, sociologically, are we so attached to our level of privacy, and so therefore should we be worried to regulate, or are people are just willing to give up? And I think, again, there needs to be an understanding on where to draw the line, how much government we want in the free market space. And I think we've been trying to do this since the 1990s in the financial markets, but I think what needs to be done is to think about this even in the tech market, on where do you draw the line on where the government should sit. And I think one of the points again on GST, again that links back to, as I was saying earlier, on how do you value labor contribution, what is the value add, and do we treat this as a luxury, do we treat this as a sin? Again, is a fundamental question. I think all of this links back to the first principles of overarching thinking about the digital economy, which I think we've left to different departments. And I think the story true for all policies in India is that there's a need for coordination. I think if you have digitalization, you have that opportunity. Why shouldn't data be shared between RBI, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and the tax department? Everyone works in a siloed manner, and they don't want to share the data with the other one. And I think what is required is a cross conversation to say that, I have this information, how do we use it? So for example, the classic case is on financial transactions. The tax department has a separate way of looking at international wealth, and the RBI will look at separate information. So why not have all of it integrated? And I think that is the power of sort of working around the digital economy.
Yeah. Aditya, you were talking about the DPDP. In fact, just as we were grappling with the draft, the TRAI also came up with some guidelines that you unsolicited, you cannot call. Almost sounds like you cannot send an email, but you can send a courier, because that is going to be delivered, and then the signature obtained, and that also probably will become prohibitory after a while. So what is the sum total of impact of this, and why is this happening? I mean, given the current regulatory environment that India is, that, wherein we are trying to ease everything, how it is going to make things more difficult?
So I think the reason that they state on the record is to protect the consumer, to find ways to protect the consumer and to try and ease the consumer's experience, so to speak. But I think, I was just going through some of the literature yesterday on the aspect of data protection, of course, but I think the same thing would apply even with respect to these TRAI regulations that have come out as well. That sometimes the regulator ends up being too clever by half. In fact, maybe sometimes is being a little polite. Quite often, it's the regulator ends up being too clever by half, and sometimes without even realizing what the real impact could be. I was reading, for instance, that the test of what constitutes a data controller under GDPR, which is pretty much the same thing as what would constitute a data fiduciary under this new data protection legislation, has been so widely worded that, in a sense, the quote-unquote real controller is able to hide behind a labyrinth of other controllers. And so in an effort to actually enhance the protection of the data subject, or what's known as a data principle over here, you end up confusing the data subject and making it impossible for them to really exercise their rights. The other point I want to make, which actually takes up from something that Pratibha was saying, was, if the effort of the legislation had really been to protect the consumer, you would have seen a little more robust framework around that. And what is missing in this data protection legislation is a clear-cut provision on, say, for example, compensation. Now, my day job is a litigator, so I've been through the draft and I've thought of different theories on how you can actually assert compensation, but you don't have something clear on that point. So the way this legislation is supposed to work is it sets out a set of rules that a data fiduciary is supposed to follow. And if the data fiduciary does not follow it, then the data fiduciary gets into trouble in terms of having to pay penalties. But on paper, at least, there's nothing that the data principal stands to benefit from a breach of her, a breach of her data, or a breach of her personal data, right? So there's a huge amount of, I would say, incongruence as far as the legislation is concerned, as far as the objects of the legislation are concerned. And I would certainly think that it's, to the extent it's possible, I don't know how much some of these things are possible, but to the extent it's possible, it's definitely worth relooking into some of these concepts.
Vivan, you essentially have been working in the area of taxation. So
No, I haven't.
moving beyond, all this regulation, and which is what, the privacy and data. Should we not focus on regulating the unregulated, the gaming, crypto?
I'm going to go
OTT,
back to the
etc.?
original question you asked, which is why is this happening? Because that's a philosophically important question, and we need to get to some semblance of an answer of that question. Can I do that?
Go ahead.
I think 4 reasons. One is that, and by this we mean the inefficiency building up, and this kind of what we've been talking about, what's happening with data protection and taxation, and then cascading impacts on other forms of regulation. One is that the internet, which gave us all a free lunch, has stopped becoming, it's not a space which is just benefiting all of society and government without caveats anymore. So over the last 4 years, since COVID in particular, we've seen the spate of cybercrime increase on the internet multifold. And that's become, and you see that every day manifest in frauds, scams, partly what you just mentioned, spam. And there is always a knee-jerk response to address these issues, because these are the bread and butter issues of politicians in a way, because if their constituencies and their people are getting impacted, and anyway we have income compression since COVID, if you're robbed of 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees, it's very meaningful in the Indian context, and you have to, as a politician, respond to that aggregate sort of concern that is building up. Every 3rd or 4th person that you'll talk to would have been scammed in some way, willfully having given information to a scammer, and so on and so forth. So one is to respond to the spate of user safety issues and cybercrime issues on the internet. We are seeing a lot of knee-jerk responses. And in part also, I think taxation, when you look at it as a penal construct, it's also trying to address that in the sphere of gaming, for instance. When you look at offshore gaming, when you look at the linkages with other areas like digital lending, etc., where there's a lot of expropriation of people who are suckered into, availing these services and then later regret it. So we're also trying to use tax as a tool to contain some of that. And the reason we are using tax as a tool is because there's limited state capacity to supervise that space overall, right? So one is this spate. The second, I think, is also the role of external actors like China. So we've been confused about what to do with China. That confusion will persist now, and particularly get worse now that Trump has started talking to China, and so on and so forth. Where does India stand amidst the great powers? It's a question for another day and an international relations discussion. But it has a bearing on our question of why this is happening, because to deal with China, we've created a lot of non-tariff barriers that are also impacting the digital space via the hardware supply chains. So we've had a lot of issues with customs, with just goods not getting in through the borders. Even American companies that are, selling you goods that you think are American, there'll always be a 10th or a 20th or a 5th of their components which are coming from China. So it's very difficult to extricate. You've seen this mess happen, play out in the EV space, where so much value was eroded because of the contestations around FAME scheme, which again, there were some random inspections of companies, and they found that there were Chinese stickers, made in China stickers on parts of, full electric vehicle, scooters, etc., that were being sold, and there's litigation that persists till this date. The point is, the China question has empowered the bureaucracy, which from the early 90s was just about getting used to the construct of letting go of the command and control, muscle of the 80s, 70s, 60s and beyond. But because we've had to give them more control to try to stem the imports from China, stem the reliance on China and all of that, it's not worked out. We still have about 120 billion in imports. Suranjali will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not stemmed the tide, and it's also created a lot of perversions in the way that we have to route our supply chains, a lot of inefficiencies, and one can argue also, obviously, long-term value is being eroded here. So now how do you roll back that command and control mindset once you've put it back on the table? It's a very difficult question. Which Babu do you convince that, hey, you will not have the power to stop that import tomorrow? He'll always make up an excuse for you to continue to wield that power, and he'll do so convincingly because he's the man on the ground. So the third is, third why is perhaps, in 2014 we had this sense that we're going to do away with corruption, and it goes back to Pratibhaji's point. I mean, SEBI, it's not just a question of, adhering to all laws of the land. Let's be clear. The NCLT, for instance, which is again a part of the mergers, the IPO process when you're doing internal mergers, within group companies, etc. You have to get permissions under the Companies Act, for instance, from NCLT before you file your draft red herring prospectus with SEBI. Even at that stage, we're seeing companies wait 18 months and beyond, and then there is a lot of rent seeking at the regional NCLT benches, which is well documented. I mean, you go have frank conversations with people who are trying to IPO. It's happening, and it doesn't matter whether it's a startup, whether it's a unicorn, sunicorn, whatever be the image associated with that brand. At the end of the day, when you're going and standing before a bench and they say, oh, by the way, you didn't file this affidavit with RBI like 5 years ago when you were supposed to. It's it's very difficult to, not feel frustrated. And I think the clarion call for reduction of corruption, and it can't be done in a wholesale manner across a country as large and diverse as this. We must be practical. But certainly when it comes to the emerging segments of business, we have to be very careful. Who are these people who are sitting and acting as the veritable thekedars for giving us permissions, licenses, permits to even raise the kind of capital and the value that we keep talking about, the wealth creation that is so important for us going ahead. And finally, I think the why is also state capacity. DPDP, he just gave an example that we don't really know what the adjudication process will look like. How will you compensate, data principals or the people whose data has been breached or whatever. There are several other instances like how do we evaluate, security standards in this country today? Are our security testing labs equipped to audit for the standards that we have set? The answer is no. Okay? So the answer is no, and you will see again and again instances of us having to defer different deadlines for security testing because our testing labs are not ready, because the standards were too complicated or too ambitious, or largely because we have not built state capacity to really understand what is at the root of that particular thematic area that we're trying to set a standard for. In this case, cybersecurity standards for, say, IoT devices. We're all over the place with issues like this. So in some sense, when we talk about a more efficient state, that doesn't need to translate into a smaller state when it comes to issues like this, surveillance, supervision, testing. We need a bigger state here. We need, by bigger I mean, we need a more capacitated state. However that capacity building happens. It doesn't mean spend money inefficiently.
So should the state not focus on the efficiency gains rather than trying to only improve, focus only on the improve the service delivery, because that is something ultimately which is going to let the government have a specific view on compliances with a specific sector rather than having a one-size-fits-all. Pratibha ji, what's your opinion?
Where is the incentive and where is the penalization? Till that happens, there's no accountability. Who is advocating for the accountability mechanism in the government? And I recognize that probably a lot of state government officials here. When we meet, very hardworking, well-meaning bureaucrats, they work very, very hard and really bring transformative changes. But there is no recognition of that work. And on the flip side, there is no penalization of places where work is not getting done. How long can this system be continuing? And this is a great initiative in that regard, that at least there is some accountability in terms of recognition provided for good work done, but it needs to be acknowledged more by the center. I think there needs to be incentives attached to the great work done by the well-meaning bureaucrats, and vice versa, the penalized. Till then, I mean, it's really, you put it in 4 points, but when you were putting in 4 points, I was like, bureaucracy, 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 bureaucracy. It just boils down to, sometimes it's well-meaning because, cyber security, absolutely. Big concern in today's world, and, I'm very glad that the government's laser focused on it, and it's very, very important. But other times it's just, missiles being fired everywhere without thinking about the consequences for the overall economy. So accountability, I think, this is a good way of doing it, but we need to highlight this a lot more.
Suraj?
No, I don't think I have much to add except for the fact that, just stressing Pratibha's point on accountability through coordination is all that I will say. Yeah.
But that's the governance part. But governance is one, and the industry is at the other end. And whatever happens at the governance level, I'm talking of compliances. The industry is always at the receiving end. The point is that we've always been creating one under the assumption that one size fits all. Assuming that the India has already become one, but India is quite diverse, and in effect we impact the comparative and the digital advantage. So this hampers businesses. And moving forward, if more of such stuff happens, what's going to be the answer? Because we may have a comparative edge, which is what we've been saying, that going to be a $30 trillion economy. How?
No, I think, again, on the small businesses versus large businesses, it's a question across regulations. The usual response is that in terms of preparedness and costs, the smaller businesses need to be treated differently. So we saw that even within the GST regime when it was introduced, the threshold for exemption was quite high initially, and then it was brought down. I similarly imagine that this would be the case in many other regulations. I think there needs to be also in the budget this year, we've redefined what a small, medium enterprise is, and that creates an exclusion for many more companies, I assume, I hope. And I think what we need to do is
that many more regulations and compliances.
I would say that that is the first step, is to figure out who you want to exclude by defining them, and then figure out what the differences in regulation look like. And I think we stress on the level playing field, but I think sometimes the level playing field is about giving a different sort of regulatory framework for different kinds of institutions. And I think that is key in terms of thinking about the costs and the processes of compliance, for small and large businesses, and I think that is quite key. So we should look forward to how we continue to define small and medium enterprises for all regulations across the board.
So before we close, let me quickly ask all the panelists, your 2 bits on what needs to be done, what's the way moving forward, 2 suggestions from each and every one of you, extremely valuable. Let's start with you.
So I don't know if I have 2 suggestions, but what I'll say is, at least as far as this issue of data protection is concerned, I think we've identified one major problem, which is that you should not be treating all businesses with a one-size-fits-all approach, right? There are small and medium enterprises and businesses that would generally fall within that category need to be treated somewhat differently. I think that seems to be almost an intuitive, certainly to my mind, an intuitive impulse. And the thing that we need to keep in mind from a legal perspective, I'm just going to present the constitutional issue which is relevant to this differential treatment. In the Puttaswamy judgment, the 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court explicitly recognized data protection as a facet of privacy, number one, and number two, they elevated privacy as a fundamental right under the Constitution. Now, what this means for the purpose of our discussion is that because of what the Supreme Court has said, there is an expectation of privacy from, for a citizen, for an individual, with literally any business that they have a relationship with. So whether you're a large business or a small business, there is an expectation of some privacy. But within that, within that general principle, if there's a possibility to demarcate certain kinds of businesses and to provide them with a different regulatory regime compared to larger businesses, I think that should be done.
Vivan?
I've given a lot of suggestions. I'll just pass it on.
Yeah, I think go back to the first comment, which is to say that I think there needs to be more effort, at least for economists as well as for policymakers, to estimate the accurate size of the digital economy, and linked to that is to define what we see as the economic priority going forward. So within the digital sector, it's not you just don't have to say that we want more startups. You want to know where you want the startups to be, in which sectors, and also in the process saying that, okay, in the way going forward, this is how we look at the gaming industry, this is how we look at crypto. We've banned and we've come down harsh on them, but will they in the future at all have any role in the economic value add at all, or this is going to be our prospective view on the sector?
Pratibha?
Actually, I just came back from Dubai, and the part of the reason for the economy booming is the crypto industry has been set up there. So we are missing the boat on that. I think creating one or focusing on one government, central government department or ministry that is responsible for looking at the effect of these new regulations on the overall economy. It shouldn't be, whatever labor wants to do, does it, whatever commerce wants to do, does it. There should be some centralized Niti Aayog, and they should be held responsible. If the economy is not meeting its target GDP growth, they are the ones who should be made some responsibility there. I think some coordination and some responsibility on the economy.
So going by the emulation that India does, looking at the US, I'm sure the Department of Governance Efficiency is going to be next on the cards for India. Well, that's a good one. So before we move on to the next, if there are any questions from the house, we'd love to take that. जी बताएं.
जैसे कि हम लोग बात करते हैं कि हर जगह हमें मेड इन चाइना का टैग मिलता है, तो जैसे हमारी गवर्नमेंट है, गवर्नमेंट का काम तो सब जगह गवर्नमेंट काम कर रही है, क्योंकि गवर्नमेंट को सोशल वेलफेयर भी करना है, एजुकेशन भी देना है, गवर्नमेंट को हेल्थ सेक्टर भी देना है, गवर्नमेंट को डिफेंस भी देखना है. अब जो हमारा प्राइवेट सेक्टर है, हम कहते हैं हमारे पास बहुत लर्नड लोग हैं, एजुकेटेड लोग हैं जो विदेशों में जाके बहुत अच्छा इनपुट दे रहे हैं। तो मैं ये चाहूँगा कि कहीं ना कहीं अगर हम रिसर्च डेवलपमेंट की बात करें तो वो भी हम चाहते हैं कि गवर्नमेंट ही करे। तो कहीं ना कहीं पर जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर है वो केवल बिजनेस करना चाहता है। तो मैं ये चाहूँगा कि जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर है, जैसे विदेशों में क्या है, मिनिमम गवर्नमेंट और मैक्सिमम गवर्नेंस, वही यहाँ पे हमारे प्रधानमंत्री जी लाना चाहते हैं। तो कहीं ना कहीं जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर भी है ना, वो भी रिसर्च डेवलपमेंट करे। क्योंकि देखिए, जब तक हम रिसर्च डेवलपमेंट नहीं करेंगे तब तक हम ये नहीं कह सकते कि अगर ये मेरा मोबाइल आ रहा है तो इसमें किसकी चिप होगी करके। मेड इन इंडिया की चिप हम तभी लगा पाएंगे जब हम खुद रिसर्च डेवलपमेंट करेंगे। तो कहीं ना कहीं जो हमारा प्राइवेट सेक्टर है, गवर्नमेंट तो सब कुछ कर ही रही है, क्योंकि अभी तक हमारे जो कंट्री में जितने भी सेक्टर्स हैं सब गवर्नमेंट द्वारा ही रन करते हैं। तो कहीं ना कहीं पर अब हमें जो है नीड है कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर भी बिजनेस के साथ साथ रिसर्च डेवलपमेंट करे और अपनी प्रोडक्ट बनाए, ठीक है। और उसके साथ तभी हम इंडिया में जो है ज़्यादा ग्रोथ ला सकते हैं। नहीं तो क्या होगा, हम डिपेंडेंट रहेंगे बाहर वालों के ऊपर। कि हमें इंजन चाहिए, किसी बाहर से ला रहे हैं, हमें
सर,
चिप
पर
चाहिए,
आपको
बाहर से
क्यों
ला रहे
लगता
हैं।
है कि वो हो नहीं रहा है प्राइवेट सेक्टर में? बहुत हो रहा है।
नहीं, कम हो रहा है अभी।
काइंड ऑफ आप थोड़ी रेगुलेशन कम करा दीजिए, थोड़ा कंट्रोल कम कर दीजिए और होगा। प्रॉफिट्स भी तो चाहिए ना। टू पुट इन R&D देयर नीड्स टू बी प्रॉफिट।
यस,
तो आई थिंक द केपेबिलिटी दैट आई सी, बिकॉज हमारा काम है टू इन्वेस्ट इन कंपनीज दैट वी थिंक आर गोइंग टू बी द नेक्स्ट $1 billion आइडिया. And the amount of talent we see and the amount of entrepreneurship we see and R&D we see in India, it's amazing. Even for climate, Delhi की air pollution की solution के लिए we had sponsored some women entrepreneurs to develop solutions. Amazing ideas that they have come up with. पर वो startup में ही इतना cost high हो जाता है इंडिया में कि वो आगे बढ़ ही नहीं पाते और फाइनेंसिंग नहीं मिलती. Where is the financing? The debt market in India has not been developed. Banks don't give money to startups. Only the private sector is giving them money. So fundamental जो structural issues हैं वो अगर solve हो जाए, you will see. I mean ऐसे ही थोड़ी ना इंडिया में वैक्सीन बनाई आता है पूरा वाला.
नहीं, वो भी गवर्नमेंट ने ही बना रखी है।
अगर आप कह रहे हैं कि गवर्नमेंट, एक दूसरा नज़रिया भी ले ले, अगर आप कह रहे हैं गवर्नमेंट इतना सारा R&D कर रही है सर, तो गवर्नमेंट की भी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी, गवर्नमेंट अपने आप के लिए नहीं है। गवर्नमेंट की जो R&D है, जब तक प्राइवेट सेक्टर तक नहीं पहुंचेगी और डिफ्यूज़ होगी जिस तरीके से एडवांस कंट्रीज़ में हो रही है, जब वो ट्रस्ट नहीं बरकरार रहेगा DRDO के बीच में या इसरो के बीच में और प्राइवेट सेक्टर के साथ, तो फिर तो वो अकाउंटेबिलिटी गवर्नमेंट को लेनी पड़ेगी। डिफ्यूजन ऑफ गवर्नमेंट R&D इनटू द प्राइवेट सेक्टर इज द गवर्नमेंट्स रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी, और उसके लिए आपको इंसेंटिव फ्रेमवर्क्स क्रिएट करने पड़ेंगे सर। आज की डेट में हमारे देश से इतना ब्रेन ड्रेन क्यों हो रहा है? अब ये तो बहुत ही बड़ा मुद्दा है, बट आप भी जानते हैं कि कहीं ना कहीं वो प्राइवेट सेक्टर का रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी नहीं है ब्रेन ड्रेन को स्टेम करना, वो हम सबकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है। हम कैसे सोचें, इंसेंटिव्स किस प्रकार के, हम साइंटिस्ट को क्या इंसेंटिव देते हैं इस देश में? आप ये सोचिए, सरकार की बात कर लीजिए, सरकारी साइंटिस्ट होने का क्या इंसेंटिव है आज की डेट में आपको, और यहाँ पे पूरा आप 30 साल बिताने का, आपको क्या मिलेगा उन 30 सालों में? 3 लाख की सैलरी। और अगर यही काम अगर आप किसी और देश में कर रहे होते एक कटिंग एज फील्ड में, आपको क्या मिलता? क्या आप पीपीपी लेवल पे भी आप कंपेयर कर पाएंगे?
हम लोग मनी के प्रोस्पेक्टिव में देख रहे हैं, तभी तो हमारा ब्रेन ड्रेन हो रहा है।
नहीं, आप
नहीं, देखिए,
आपको लगता है कि पैसों की कोई वैल्यू नहीं है लाइफ में, तो फिर वो अलग बात है, और दूसरा डिस्कशन है सर।
हमारा कंट्री जो है वो इतना ज़्यादा अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकता, जितना पेमेंट नहीं दे सकता। तो जितना हमें दे रहा है गवर्नमेंट, बहुत दे रही है, ठीक है। और अगर हम कर रहे हैं तो हमें अपना बेस्ट करना चाहिए, ठीक है।
देखिए, उसमें दोनों ही
अगर हम यूएस की कंपैरिजन
दोनों ही पहलू
नहीं कर सकते।
आप बोल रहे हैं वो एकदम सही है, और जो पैनल बता रहा है वो भी अपनी जगह पर सही है, क्योंकि कारण ये है कि हम उसको किस तरफ से देख रहे हैं। यहाँ से हम आपको देख रहे हैं, आप वहाँ से इस तरफ देख रहे हैं। हालांकि एक ही सिक्के के दो पहलू हैं। उसी को ही ब्रिज करने के लिए, जो बीच में उनकी खाई थी, उसी को ब्रिज करने के लिए जो गवर्नेंस एफिशिएंसी की बात हो रही है, सरकार जो है वो जनता के लिए करती है। आप लोग सरकार हैं, अपने लिए नहीं करते हैं, आप लोग जनता के लिए ही करते हैं। बट कहीं पे आप सर्विसेज के लिए कर रहे हैं, कहीं पे आप प्रोडक्शन के लिए कर रहे हैं। दो ही चीज़ें हैं, या तो रेल इकोनॉमी है, रेल सेक्टर है, या सर्विस इकोनॉमी है, सर्विस सेक्टर है। जी
सर, आदित्य जी से क्वेश्चन था। अब सर, इफ यू टॉक अबाउट DPDP, देयर इज अ कंपनसेशन ऑफ आई थिंक 250 crores for per data breach. But there is a slight confusion, sir. If you say if any company whose data has been breached and being sold on the dark web, the ransomware guy, the hacker, they hardly demand 20 crore, 30 crores. It's may go high. I come from a law enforcement background, so I have seen one case where there was a ransomware attack on West Bengal, one of the website of the West Bengal. Though it was later we modified it, but the amount was very less. So, don't you think that the company will start dealing, under the table when they will cover up if there is a data breach? Because if they come into the light, the government will impose a penalty of up to 250 crores. So the DPDP Act, sir, itself is a confusing because the company will try to, not make it into the public. They will try to deal directly with the hackers. कि अच्छा ठीक है, मेरा data breach हो गया, ये लो 20 crore, give us the data. So the penalty amount that we are imposing on DPDP Acts is, I think it will create that direct dealing under the table, sir.
So I have 2 points to make.
almost time for you.
First is that what you described, as you said, right now is a penalty. It's not a compensation. Penalty goes into the Consolidated Fund of India. It does not go to the consumer. And what I was talking about is what compensation does the consumer get, which is separate from the penalty. That I said that there's no framework for compensation. At least it seems as if there's no framework as such for compensation in the text of the data protection legislation, number one. Number two, on your second point, will these extremely high penalties which are set out in Schedule 1 of the legislation incentivize this kind of behavior which you are describing? Yes, there's a very high possibility that rather than deal with the data protection board, you might find that some data fiduciaries will find it more efficient to actually have those conversations with the hackers and try and settle it without anybody getting to know about it. But the problem is that if it is subsequently discovered that something of this sort has happened, then there are even higher penalties that become imposable upon a data fiduciary who does not report to the data protection board.
So one more writing, sir. Sir, can individual directly don't go to the companies for their compensation? Because वहाँ पे सारे क्लॉज में है कि इंडिविजुअल डायरेक्ट उसको नहीं कर सकते कंपनसेशन के लिए, थोड़ा सा उस पर क्लियर करेंगे सर?
So under the legislation, there is nothing which allows the individual to go to the company. Sometimes, if you look at some of the privacy policies, within the privacy policy, they say that the data fiduciary will give compensation up to, let's say, for example, ₹100. But there are a number of ways in which you can get around it from a legal perspective. The Data Protection Act says that you can't go to the civil court, but that restriction only applies in respect of matters which are covered under the data protection legislation. So if compensation is not covered under the data protection legislation, then you might be able to go to the civil court and claim damages. It's just that it will take a lot of time. You'll have to pay court fees. It becomes inefficient to do it. So there are ways in which that can be done.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yes, please.
I've been very inspired by this session. When I was preparing for this conference, एक कहावत आ रही थी मेरे दिमाग में और मुझे लग रहा था कि शायद मुझे नहीं बोलनी चाहिए, तो आई हैड काइंड ऑफ मेड अप माई माइंड कि ये मैं नहीं बोलूँगा. ये पैनल सुनने के बाद आई एम फीलिंग कंपेल्ड टू शेयर दैट कहावत. वो कहावत है कि घोड़ी नाल लगा रही थी और मेंढकी साथ में खड़ी हो गई. तो इंडिया 2047 में विकसित भारत बनेगा और जो विकसित देश आज हैं उनका जो फ्रेमवर्क है वो हम आज से ले लें. मतलब वो घोड़ी है, उसको नाल लगाने की ज़रूरत है, हमें अभी नहीं है, अभी हम गरीब देश हैं. और जो ये पैनल डिस्कशन हुआ है और जो मैंने ऑडियंस का भी रिएक्शन देखा है, तो मेरे ख्याल इस चीज़ की भी समझ के ये रेगुलेशन का कितना डेवस्टेटिंग इकोनॉमिक इम्पैक्ट है, शायद किसी को कॉम्प्रिहेंशन इसका नहीं हो पा रहा है. इंडिया बोलते हैं कंजम्पशन ड्रिवन इकोनॉमी है, लोग खरीदेंगे तभी इकोनॉमी बढ़ेगी. और इस वक्त जो इंटरेस्ट रेट कट की बात हो रही है और ईजिंग की बात हो रही है और सबसे बड़ा पॉइंट ऑफ कंसर्न यही है कि कंजम्पशन कम हो रही है। अब आप ये बताइए कि अगर कंज्यूमर के तक पहुंचने के सारे रास्ते बंद कर दोगे, आप उसको चिट्ठी नहीं लिख सकते, उसको आप ईमेल नहीं भेज सकते, आप उसको फ़ोन नहीं कर सकते, तो डोर टू डोर जाके आप कितनी कंजम्पशन करा लोगे? और आपका प्रोडक्ट है जो उसके किसी काम आ सकता है, उसको आप कैसे बताओगे? सो वी आर टेकिंग अ कॉन्शियस लीप बैकवर्ड्स वेयर वी आर सेइंग कि आप ईमेल छोड़िए, आप स्नेल मेल कीजिए, पोस्ट कार्ड भेजिए सबको। पहले आते थे पोस्ट कार्ड, पोस्ट कार्ड भेज दीजिए, वो लीगल है। ईमेल भेजेंगे तो इलीगल है, एसएमएस भेजेंगे तो इलीगल है ना? और अगर आपको मैंने ब्रॉडकास्ट करके बताना है कि मेरे पास एक अच्छा प्रोडक्ट है, तो मेरे पास सिर्फ अखबार में इश्तिहार देने के अलावा कोई और रास्ता नहीं है, टेलीविजन पे इश्तिहार देने के अलावा कोई रास्ता नहीं है। तो एक माइक्रो स्मॉल और मीडियम एंटरप्राइज कहां से लाएगा वो बजट? तो आप बाय लॉ इंश्योर कर देंगे कि सिर्फ देश में बड़ी बड़ी 5-10 कंपनियां हो और बाकी सबका काम बंद हो जाए। कितना % जीडीपी ये शेव ऑफ करेगा? सुरंजलि, आई थिंक यू शुड रियली वर्क ऑन दैट। ऑफ ऑल दीज रेगुलेटरी थिंग्स, what is likely to be the impact on GDP? My rough estimate is कि सिर्फ ये DPDP एक्ट और जो TRI की जो कॉलिंग वाली कहानी है, ये दोनों को जोड़ के अगर आप स्ट्रिक्टली इंप्लीमेंट कर दो तो कम से कम 2% GDP लूज हो जाएगा, अगर उसको आप सीरियसली। तो जिसको मैं बोल रहा हूँ कि घोड़ी नाल लगाए, मेंढकी को नहीं लगवानी चाहिए। एंड लेट अस बी वेरी क्लियर ऑन दैट। विद दैट आई डेफर टू my mentor and my Swaraj Guru, Ashwini Mahajan ji, who is going to make some comments.
आइए वहीं आ जाइए।